Good evening. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent for Englebrook Independent News. Thank you for joining me on Haylee on America's Daily. Tonight, we're taking a closer look at several significant decisions issued this week by the Supreme Court of the United States as courts conclude its 2025-2026 term. Over the next several minutes, we'll explain what courts decide, the legal questions presented in each case, how the justice votes when the votes count were reported, and what these decisions may mean for Americans going forward. Our goal this evening is straightforward: to present the facts, explain the legal reasoning, and to help you better understand the work of the nation's highest courts. Whether you agree or disagree with any individual ruling, decisions of the Supreme Court often shape the interpretation of the Constitution and federal law for decades to come. They influence the power of the President and the Congress, and the authority of state, the rights of individual citizens, and the operation of federal government. As always, our reporting tonight is based on court-published opinions and publicly available court records. Let's begin with one of Monday's most closely watched decisions. The first major decision involved Watson versus Republican National Committee, a dispute over Mississippi absentee ballot law. At issue was whether federal election status requires every absentee ballot to be physically received by Election Day, or whether state may count ballots that are postmarked Election Day but arrive several days after under state law. Mississippi law permits certain absentee ballots to be counted if they are postmarked no later than Election Day and received within a limited period afterwards. Opponents argue that federal law establishes a single national election day and therefore requires all ballots in federal elections to be received by that date. Supporters of Mississippi law argue that Congress established the date on which voters must cast their ballots, but did not require election officials to finish receiving or counting every ballot on the same day. The Supreme Court agreed with Mississippi. In its opinion, the court held that the relevant federal election statute do not prohibit states from counting absentee ballots that are timely postmarked and received within period of authorized by state law. The majority concluded that nothing in the federal statute required every ballot to arrive by Election Day itself. The decision leaves similar absentee ballot procedures in place not only in Mississippi, but also in several other states that use comparable postmark deadlines. Supporters of the ruling said it respects states' authority over election administration and protect voters who mail ballots on time but experience postal delays. Critics argue that allowing ballots to arrive after Election Day would prolong election administration and publicly uncertainty following close races. Importantly, the court ruling addressed the interpretation of federal election statute. It did not establish a nationwide ruling requiring every state to accept late-arriving absentee ballots. Instead, the decision leaves states with flexibility where federal law does not expressly prohibit those procedures. Our next case examines the scope of presidential authority over independent federal agencies, an issue that has generated significant constitutional debate concerning the separation of power. Our next decision concerns a constitutional question that has been the subject of debate among legal scholars, former government officials, and presidential administrations of both political parties for decades. At its core, the issue was this: how much authority does the President of the United States have to remove the leader of certain independent federal agencies? The Constitution vests executive power in the President, and over many years, the Supreme Court has issued a series of opinions addressing how much control the President may exercise over executive branch officials. In this week's discussion, the court further clarified its interpretation of the presidential authority over executive officers. The majority concluded that under the Constitution, the President generally possesses broader authority to supervise officials who exercise executive power. In reaching the conclusion, the court relied on its previous separation of power precedent and emphasized that the political accountability within the executive branch ultimately rests on the elected president. The majority reasoned that allowing the president to direct or, where permitted by law, remove executive officials helps ensure the executive power remains accountable to voters throughout the office of the president. However, the courts also noticed the constitutional questions involving independent agencies often depending on specific statutory framework enacted by the Congress and the nature of the office involved. As a result, the practical impact of the decision may differ from one agency to another. As it often the case is closely watched constitutional disputes. Not every justice agrees with the majority reasoning. The dissenting justice expressed concerns that expanding presidential control over certain independent agencies could diminish Congress' longstanding efforts to isolate the governmental functions from direct political influence. The dissent argued that the independence has historically been viewed by Congress as an important safeguard for agencies responsible for carrying out specialized regulatory responsibilities. According to the dissent, weakening those protections could alter the balance among the three branches of the government. The majority, however, concluded that the Constitution ultimately places executive order in the president, and the separation of power principle requires meaningful presidential supervision over officers exercising executive power. While legal scholars will likely continue debating the broader constitutional implications of this ruling, one point is clear. This decision represents another significant chapter in the Supreme Court's ongoing effort to define the respective power of executive and legislative branches under the Constitution. As with many constitutional decisions, its full effects will likely unfold throughout the future litigation and additional court ruling. For viewers watching tonight, it's worth remembering that Supreme Court decisions are not intended to determine whether a policy is politically popular or unpopular. Instead, the court's responsibility is to interpret the Constitution and federal law as the justice understands them. Responsible people, including judges, can and often disagree about those interpretations, which is why many landmark decisions include both majority and dissenting opinions. Reading both of the majority opinions and the dissent can provide valuable insight into the competing constitutional argument considered by the court. Up next, we'll examine Tuesday's major decision, including one of the most closely watched rulings of the term involving restrictions participation on girls' and women's school athletic teams based on biological sex, nationwide injunctions, and birthright citizenship. We'll explain what the court decided, what questions remain unsolved, and what the ruling means procedurally for the lower federal courts moving forward. Stay with us. In a 6-3 decision on the Equal Protection Clause and a unanimous ruling on the Title IX issue, the Supreme Court upheld state law enacted by Idaho and West Virginia that limited participation in girls' and women's school sports teams to students whose biological sex is female. The cases before the court were West Virginia v. BPJ and Title V Hayaks. The legal challenge centered on whether these state laws violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and Title IX, the federal law that prohibited sex discrimination in federal-funded educational programs. Supporters of the law argue that the state has a legitimate interest in preserving competitive fairness and safety in girls' and women's athletics by classifying teams according to biological sex. Those challenging the laws argue that the restrictions unlawfully discriminate against transgender girls and denying them equal educational opportunities guaranteed under federal law and the Constitution. Writing for the majority, Justice Brett Kavanaugh concluded that the Constitution permits states to maintain separate athletic competition from males and females, and that Idaho and West Virginia's laws do not violate either the Equal Protection Clause or Title IX. The majority reasoned that the state had identified legitimate government interests in promoting competitive fairness and protecting opportunities in girls' and women's athletics. The court emphasizes that the decision has limited to school athletics and the legal question presents in these cases. The ruling does not require every state to adopt similar laws. Instead, it confirms that states choosing to enact such eligibility rules may do so consistent with the Constitution and federal laws as interpreted by the courts. States that have different policies remain free to maintain them unless future litigation or legislation changes in the legal landscape. The court's 3 dissenting justices disagreed with the majority constitutional analysis. They argued that the challenged law unfairly excluded transgender students from schools' athletics and that the Equal Protection Clause and Title IX should be interpreted to provide broader protection against discrimination based on gender identity. They also expressed concerns about the practical consequences from transgender youth participating in school sports. This decision is expected to have a significant implication nationwide. More than 24 states have enacted laws addressing transgender participation in girls and women's sports. The court's ruling provides a guidance of lower courts reviewing similar laws, while leaving rooms for continued debate for legislation, schools, athletic association, and future litigation over related questions not resolved by the decision. Regardless of what Americans stand on their issue, the court decision represents another significant interpretation of both the Constitution and Title IX, and it's likely to remain an important part of the national legal conversation for years to come. Our next ruling addresses one of the most closely watched constitutional questions before the court this year: birthright citizen under the 14th Amendment. At the center of the case was an executive order issued by President Donald Trump seeking to limit automatic U.S. citizenship for certain children born in the United States to parents who were in the country unlawfully or temporarily. Supporters of the executive order argue that the phrase "subject to jurisdiction thereof" in the 14th Amendment should be interpreted more narrowly than it has been for the past century. Opponents argue that long-standing Supreme Court precedent, particularly in the court's 1898 decision in the United States versus Wong Kim Ark, was consistently recognized that nearly everyone born in the United States soil will ultimately, with limited exceptions such as children of foreign diplomats, is entitled for U.S. citizenship. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court rejected the executive order and held that it conflicted with the Citizen Clause of the 14th Amendment. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the majority opinion. The courts concluded that the Constitution's text, historical understanding, and long-standing precedents supported the principle of birthright citizens for the children born in the United States, regardless of their parents' immigration status in most circumstances. The majority emphasized that the changing this constitutional rule would require a constitutional amendment or another lawful constitutional mechanism, not an executive order alone. 3 justices dissented. The dissent argued that the court should have adopted a different interpretation of the 14th Amendment and questioned whether the citizenship clause was intended to extend automatically to every child born in the United States, regardless of the legal status of the parent. As with many constitutional decisions, both the majority and dissent relied heavily on historical sources, prior court decisions, and competing interpretations of the constitutional text. For Americans, the practical efforts of the ruling is the long-established understanding of the birthright citizen remains in place. For now, children born in the United States continue to receive U.S. citizenship under the constitutional framework that existed for generations. The Supreme Court work often extends well beyond the immediate parties involved in the lawsuit. Its opinions establish legal precedent that lower federal and state courts generally must follow. As a result, many of the court's decisions shape public policy, influence future legislation, and guide constitutional interpretation for years or even decades to come. This is why each opinion released during the final days of the Supreme Court term is closely watched by attorneys, lawmakers, government officials, scholars, and citizens across the country. With these decisions, the Supreme Court has now concluded another consequential term. Throughout the year, the justice has heard cases involving executive authority, immigration, election laws, administration agencies, civil rights, and other constitutional questions affecting millions of Americans. Although the court's term has ended, the legal and political discussions surrounding many of these decisions are likely to continue into Congress, state legislators, lower courts, and throughout the nation. Up next, we'll step back for the individual cases and look at the broader role of the Supreme Court within our constitutional system, what these rulings collectively tell us about the court approach this term, and why understanding the judicial branch remains essential for every American, regardless of the political affiliation. As we discussed throughout tonight's special report, the Supreme Court's final decision of the term addressed a wide range of constitutional and legal questions, from the separation of power and authority of the executive branch to election laws and the interpretation of the 14th Amendment. While each case involves its own unique facts and legal arguments, they all share one common trend. They require the justice to interpret the Constitution and federal law, often in cases where they resemble legal minds reach different conclusions. That is one of the defining characteristics of our judicial system. Unlike Congress, who writes laws, or President, who enforces them, the Supreme Court role is determined to what law means when dispute arises. In doing so, the court decision becomes precedent that guides lower courts across the country. The Supreme Court's opinion frequently shapes how constitutional principles are applied in everyday life. Some decisions affirm existing precedent, others clarify legal standards, and from time to time, the court issued ruling that significantly reshaped the legal landscape. Regardless of the outcome of an individual case, the publication of the Supreme Court opinions is really the end of the conversation. New legal challenges may arise. Congress may choose to amend federal statutes. State government may revise their own laws. And in certain circumstances, the constitutional questions may return to the court in future cases with different facts or legal issues. That ongoing process is one of the ways that Americans' legal system continues to evolve while remaining grounded in the Constitution. The decisions issued this week also demonstrate another important aspect of the court's work. Even when the justice agrees on an outcome of a case, they do not always agree on the legal reasoning that should lead to the result. Majority opinions, concurring opinions, dissenting opinions all become part of the historical record. For attorneys, judges, scholars, and students of constitutional law, those writings provide valuable insight into how justice interprets the Constitution and how future legal questions may be analyzed. For the public, they offer an opportunity to better understand not only what the court decide, but why. Many Americans understandably focus on the immediate impact of Supreme Court ruling, but the broader significance often emerges over time. A constitutional interpretation announced today may influence legislation, government policy, and future court decisions for years to come. That is why following the work of the Supreme Court is an important part of understanding how our constitutional republic functions. Whether a decision receives widespread public support or criticism, the court's opinion remains an essential part of our system of checks and balances. Here at Englebrook Independent News, our commitment is to provide reporting that is accurate, carefully sourced, and presented with context needed to help viewers understand complex issues. Our goal is not simply to report headlines, but to explain the facts, the legal principles involved, and the potential implications of significant events affecting our nation. As always, we encourage our viewers to read the court's opinions for themselves whenever possible. The published decision provides the most complete explanation of the legal reasoning behind each ruling and allows every American to examine the court's work firsthand. That concludes tonight's special report on this week's decisions of the Supreme Court of the United States. Thank you for spending part of your evening with us. And if you found tonight's program informative, we invite you to join again as we continue covering stories shaping our nation, from Washington to your local communities, with commitment to fairness, accuracy, and thoughtful reporting. For continued coverage, analysis, and updates on national, state, and local news, stay with Englebrook Independent News. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent for Englebrook Independent News. On behalf of all of us at Englebrook Independent News, thank you for watching Haylee's on America Daily. Have a safe evening and take care of one another, and we'll see you again very soon. Good night.